Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Defenders of Wildlife, we are so pleased to have you at our 9th and final webinar in our 9-part Wildlife and Wind Energy webinar series. This 9th webinar is going to focus on future priorities for wildlife and wind energy, and we have a great group of multi-stakeholder representatives that are going to share their perspectives on challenges and opportunities. All right, sorry. So first, we're going to do some housekeeping for those who are familiar. You will be muted throughout the webinar, but you can communicate with us through the questions feature. If you are having trouble with audio, try calling in on your phone. That usually fixes it. And for some quick webinar norms, one, a quick disclaimer. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory is a policy neutral organization, so any views and opinions expressed in this series are those of the speakers and do not reflect the views or position of NREL or the Department of Energy. Next, of course, assume positive intent. This webinar, like all of our webinars, bring together a really diverse group of stakeholders from across the wind wildlife community, and they're going to present their various perspectives. We are going to do our best to avoid acronyms and make this accessible to everyone, but if you have a question on an acronym or a concept that one of our speakers are using, feel free to use the question box. And again, we really encourage you to use the question box throughout this webinar, and for our panel on the latter half, the success of this webinar is really going to depend on your good questions. So if you missed any of our previous 8 webinars or want to watch them again, they are available. The recordings are on Tepis, and this is where you can learn more. All right, so now on to the main event. We are really excited about this webinar. You can see the diverse perspectives and the incredible speakers we have lined up for today. First, we're going to have 2 speakers that are going to give you a broad overview. Mike Spearschneider will kick it off. He is the Senior Director of Permitting Policy and Environmental Affairs at the American Wind Energy Association. And Mike is going to give us a perspective of a future build-out from an industry perspective. Then he'll kick it off to Dave Young, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Western Ecosystems Technology, Inc. And he's going to look at grand challenges and future research priorities based on involving industry and climate. From there, we'll have some brief moments for y'all to ask them questions, and then we're going to shift over to our panel. But for now, I am going to leave it in Mike's hands. And so, Mike, if you want to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Joy. And let me make sure that this is projecting in the right way. Okay, this looks okay for me, so I'm going to get going here. Thank you, Joy, and thank you to NREL for hosting this webinar series. Really pleased to be a part of this last panel and talk about the future of wind energy. As Joy said, I'm with the American Wind Energy Association, Senior Director for Permitting Policy and Environmental Affairs. Should note now that many of you may have seen or are aware that AWEA is expanding. I guess you would say is becoming the American Clean Power Association. That change will take effect on January 1st in the new year. So it just reflects the sort of the broad issues that are being addressed by more than just wind energy. It's across the renewable energy sector. So we will be covering solar and battery storage more closely, and I think it's a real opportunity and hopefully be a good resource for many of you that are listening in for us to continue to work in those capacities as well. So we'll look forward to that future for AWEA, and now I'll talk a little bit more about the future of wind energy. And as I go through this, a couple of key points to keep in mind. And I'll try to get these through as I go through. But the first thing is that the deployment of land-based wind energy is really essential for combating climate change, well, that is something that I know a lot of people are interested in and care about. And I think one of the things that'll come clear is that the quote unquote the status quo or business as usual case, kind of looking at our traditional annual growth. It's not going to get the job done, and so we need to do things differently. We need to look at how we can solve that, and I think those solutions are both within the wind energy industry itself, but through market and regulatory structures as well. Took a look about the challenges, kind of feeding off of that, the challenges of to build out, and then finish up with some considerations of the benefits that wind energy makes and how those might be able to be brought into the decision making in a little bit more specific way. So we'll keep those things in mind as we go through, and hopefully this will all make sense. So let's start with the build out. Some of this you may already be familiar with, but just a current snapshot of where we are. This is actually about a quarter ago, third quarter of 2020. We were at about 111 gigawatts of total installed capacity. You can see there the last few years, we've been sort of hovering around that 8,000, give or take, megawatts per year installed. And that's kind of the pace that we've been going at least in the recent history. Those ebbs and flows that you see in that chart, you know, mostly policy driven, but also some market driven as well. This one, just want to give you a sense. The only thing to pay attention on this, and this is the power mix of new generation year by year. So new builds. This doesn't represent what's in the ground total, but just the new stuff that goes in year by year. And the thing to note there is, you know, the recent past is really dominated by wind, solar, and natural gas. And those are kind of the three things that are really driving, really coming in for new generation. And then, you know, as that growth happens, you know, when I started in this business, we were, you know, a fraction of a percent of the total energy generation in the country. As of the end of 2019, above 7% and kind of approaching 10% now with the strong year in 2020. So, you know, it's kind of moving, the industry is moving from a niche market that has a couple of you know, that's trying to get traction to, you know, once you get to that 10%, it's one of the real players in the industry or in the sector, and providing some pretty substantial energy to fuel our modes of you know, our daily life, and I think that's an important way. Obviously, when you talk about growth, you got to talk about offshore. I'm not going to talk about that too much here in today's presentation, but I'm sure everybody's aware that offshore is starting to get some real legs under it, and we've got through various policies and you know, state, and also if you look at some of the leasing of those offshore areas through the federal government, looking at, you know, somewhere in that range of, you know, 15, 20, 25 gigawatts by the end of this decade. So that's a real growth path there, and a lot of attention being paid to offshore, and obviously it's something we is looking at and supporting, but again, not what I'll be focusing on today. I will look back on land, and just to give you a sense, I mean, this is depicting both capacity under construction and in advanced development. So this is sort of the more immediate future of what's going on. And 43 gigawatts is pretty impressive for that sort of, call it short term, maybe going out 2, 3, 4 years. And you get a lot of that. The other thing to notice from this slide is, you know, where that's happening. A lot of it is in the middle of the country, a little bit on the coast, you know, especially you see that little bubble there on the right of the off-course mid-Atlantic, offshore mid-Atlantic, which is where a lot, at least the early activity on offshore is happening. So the other things that's driving growth and the build out, at least from a policy standpoint, there's a couple of things, and one, and I just noticed now, my slide on PTC did not make it into the deck, but obviously the PTC has been for a while one of the main drivers to production tax credit. That is, right now, we're in the last year, it's being ramped down. So projects that are under construction by the end of this year, so in the next couple of weeks, will qualify for the PTC, and they'll have about 4 years to get those projects up and running. So we're kind of at the end of that. Don't have a crystal ball in terms of where that will go, but it's always in the discussion for future policies. But that is the main driver. Aside from that, we do have the state RPS, renewable portfolio standards. And those are the requirements state by state for renewable energy. And that, the thing to take from this slide is you're looking forward to 2030, and RPS state demand will support we think about 25 gigawatts of new wind capacity in that time. So it's still an important driver. and something that's kind of a changing landscape as we go. And then, of course, the other driver is cost. Clearly, you've got to have a cost-competitive product to support projects, and the industry, for a variety of different advancements over the last decade or two, has the levelized cost of energy has come down quite a bit, and is now, in terms of new build, is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in terms of average price, which obviously drives a lot of the build out, because it from a cost standpoint, people like to buy the product that is the cheapest. So just as a snapshot, 112 or so gigawatts in the ground right now, or maybe about 8 gigawatts per year. It's driven by PTC, driven by the state RPSs, and will be somewhat driven by offshore as well in the next decade for sure. And then, so we can look at that and look at that sort of average per year growth and say, in the next decade, another decade, we might close to double that installed capacity to 200 gigawatts. And by 2050, if you go out another couple of decades, maybe at 400. And I made my little asterisk there. Don't take this and say, hey, WEA says we're going to be 400 gigawatts at 2050. It's just kind of a extension of that sort of business as usual case, but it's not anything that's an official estimate or projection. But it's for illustrative means, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. Because the next thing I wanted to talk about was, well, there's the climate part of this. So there's that policy, how the industry is moving, and then there's what I think a lot of you all are focused on is climate. I'm interested in climate. Had a couple of reports coming out recently, including the Audubon Species on the Brink paper, just spelling out in the IPCC reports climate change. I did a special report about a year ago or more, just looking at the potential impacts if global temperature, average global temperatures continue to increase. And we look at that kind of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase, and the major issues that could result of that, and looking at what kind of policies can keep us within a reasonable range on that. And if you look at that, the build outs, there's been a number of different groups that are looking at how you actually can do that given where we are right now. And a lot of the fallout from those kind of assessments as well, land-based wind in the US would have to be on the order of about 1,000 gigawatts of new wind installed by 2050. So that assumes a lot of different things, assumes a real big push on solar, assumes some other things within our economy, including electrification of auto fleets and some other things. So it's a lot of things built into that, but that's a pretty significant amount of growth. And just to show kind of where we are, and I think this is a key slide, a key thing to look at is, that what I showed, that sort of hypothetical 400 gigawatts by 2050, call it the business as usual. Maybe add a little bit of incremental improvements on that, just sort of arbitrarily. So by the 2040s, maybe we're growing at 20 gigawatts a year instead of 10. That still gets you to about 560. To get to that 1,000 plus, call it 1,200 gigawatts to actually really make a difference when it comes to climate change, we're not even halfway there. And that really is the problem in a nutshell. How do we get this industry to be able to achieve that and really be part of that global solution really for climate change? Well, how do we do that? There's a lot of different things that have to go into that. The build out are some challenges. We quickly go through these a bit. I think this is a lot of what the discussion has been in the series, so we really appreciate that. Obviously there's a lot of wildlife things that we look at. This is just a list of the things: habitat, species, congregation, kind of those sensitive areas where species and their habitat are. We also, keeping in mind that there's wildlife, non-wildlife things as well that have to be present for a viable project. Got to have the right land use, compatible land use, bulk transmission, adequate wind source, of course, and then it's got to all fit into a place on the map and where the wind is. And this just kind of shows, well, that's where the wind is. A lot of it's in the center of the country, like we all saw, like I saw before, kind of reflected in the build that's happening. Problem is there's not a lot of people in the middle of the country, so you need to have transmission. That's a whole other subject on the transmission. This is just a snapshot of the some of the transmission projects that have been put in place in 2019, so going back a ways, but still this is happening. But there's a lot of challenges there, both wildlife and otherwise. So that's all challenges coming together. And then the other thing as we look at, obviously the wildlife, to be more specific about the wildlife and the habitat challenges, a lot of attention on, traditionally at least, on direct impacts, predicting and estimating how many fatal collisions there are with the flying species, of course, and also some habitat. And what does that mean? What is the impact? So we spent a lot of time on that, a lot of resources on trying to answer those questions. Direct impact is one that's also something that we've spent a lot of resources on, but is maybe becoming a bigger focus as we move forward, especially when we're talking about landscape level impacts. And the thing I wanted to note here is the same kind of issues there. What do you predict the impacts are, and how do you estimate, do that impact assessment? That's not very straightforward. A lot of challenges there figuring that out. And of course, once I like to say it as, if we're looking at the number of bats that collide with wind turbines, that's something that we can kind of look at within the industry and say, okay, what can we do? Increase cutting speeds, deterrence, those kind of things. We're talking about habitat level impacts. The problem becomes a lot bigger than just wind. And so the solutions have to be a lot bigger than just wind. And I think that's, when you look at challenges to the build out and the future of wind, I think we've really got to be cognizant of that and look into the sort of those little big pictures. And a lot of it comes down to siting. And we talk a lot about siting. We need to do siting in a way that we can avoid those impacts to begin with. And as the industry, we totally agree with that. We do have the wind energy guidelines that help on that. But the danger there is just, it's hard to have it as just one single factor to say, hey, just go where these things aren't, or go where there are these attributes and do that. One of the things we're trying to kind of convey here is there's a lot of different things going on, so it's hard to just kind of pick, look at one issue and say that's where you should focus on your siting. And that's been a challenge and something that I think we're working to better understand. So let me just finish up here with some of the benefits, and I think the way they put this, and as I'm building this narrative, this picture is there are a lot of things that wind energy provides when it comes to wildlife and habitat, and whether it's looking at landscape planning or even looking at some of the direct impacts and considering some of the broader benefits is something that I think could help us kind of get to that level of build out that we really need to see those climate and other benefits. The first one is, okay, support to local economies. Well, what does that mean? $1.6 billion to state and local communities. I think the point here is the projects, the industry is traditionally in rural areas, and it's a lot of these economic benefits, payments to landowners, allows the landowners to keep the land use in a consistent way, and we are. I think we need to look a little bit more at what are the preservation benefits of that. How does that work if that land might be used for something else if it weren't for wind, and that's an important part of a benefit that I think we need to better understand. And then there's also just we've seen this is kind of the bread and butter here, the emissions offsets, and obviously carbon is the big one, but SOx and NOx are also weighed pretty heavily on the advantages of where wind is. So those are clearly some benefits that realized across the country and really across the globe.
Michael?
Yeah.
Pardon me. I'm so sorry for the interruption. We're getting some feedback from viewers that there's some issues with the audio and connection. If you don't mind going off video, it might free up, sorry about the dog, some bandwidth so that the connection's a little bit better.
Okay. Sorry about that. I hope people were able to understand as I went through that. About to the end here, is that any better?
Yeah, it seems to be better so far. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies. So this last slide, I know it's a bit hard to see, but just kind of an outline of the different called milestones or activities that the industry has taken in the last couple of decades to really address and advance the understanding of wind and wildlife and solutions on to minimize, reduce those impacts, and really, make it what we all got into the business for, is to have a better, cleaner, more sustainable solution for power generation, and doing that in a way that's on brand. So that's kind of the end of it. Just kind of going back to that last slide's coming up, but the no, there it is. The again, the key points: deployment of wind is really essential on the climate stage, and we really need to kind of step up and get from 8 to 10 gigawatts per year to something more like 35 or 40. There are challenges with doing that, obviously, finding viable sites while considering wildlife habitat issues and the other things that are needed for viable projects. And then, I think part of the solution, part of how you think about this is, what are some of the benefits that wind energy brings, especially when you're talking about alternatives to more traditional ways of generating power. So with that, obviously, I'll take some questions at the right time. And I think now, though, I'm going to hand it over to Dave Young from West to talk about some of the grand challenges on the research side.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. And Dave, I think we're going to have you stay off camera too, if you don't mind, just because of the connectivity issues.
Okay, that'll work. Can you guys hear me well?
Yep, you sound great right now. I'll interrupt you if you start waning.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you, Joy and Chris and other organizers for this, for inviting me to help with this concluding webinar in the series. And turning our attention to the future and leveraging kind of the knowledge base that we've accumulated over the years is one of the things I've been pushing for in more recent years. So hopefully by spending some time talking about this topic today, we can build more momentum in that direction. When thinking about the grand challenge of future research priorities based on evolving industry and climate change, there are a few ways to address this topic. What questions do we need to answer, and what data should be collected to answer those questions? But also, given that the technology is changing, how does that affect the way we would approach research to answer questions? So initially, let's address the latter question and think about what tools we use to answer the questions, and how might those need to change given the change in technology. As we continue to learn more about wind energy impacts on wildlife and learn what new questions to ask, there's somewhat of an arms race in progress.
Yeah.
Excuse me, was that a question?
Yeah, I think we have somebody that is not on mute. If everyone can mute, of the panel, of the organizers, so if you can mute your line.
Sorry about that.
It's not your fault.
As we continue to learn more about wind energy impacts on wildlife and learn what the new questions to ask are, there's somewhat of an arms race in progress, if you will. As the technology improves and changes, our knowledge base about that technology kind of lags behind. With changing technology, some basic questions that we have been answering based on that older or existing technology may not be the correct answer if technology was sort of the driving factor there. I came across this illustration on the DOE website that illustrates changes in turbine technology well over the last few decades. When I first started studying wind, turbine, and wildlife interactions in '95, the cutting edge technology was around 600 to 750 kilowatt turbines, which were on 40-meter tall towers and had 20-meter long blades. And today, there's 3.4 to 4.2 megawatt turbines are common on the landscape. And these have about 132 to 150 meter diameter rotors and towers ranging from 80 to 100 meters at hub height. Also, turbines in the late 90s and early 2000s typically operated in stronger winds around 4 meters per second cut-in wind speed. Today, many turbines generate electricity starting at 3 meters per second wind speed and may continue to generate in slightly lower wind speeds. So this increase in size of turbines and perhaps the overall size of wind projects comes to needs to adapt or change the way the studies are designed. In the average development life cycle of a wind project, there are typically a few to several phases or tiers of study when it comes to assessing or measuring impacts from a project. Many projects follow the wind energy guidelines that Mike mentioned, and their tiered approach, beginning with some literature data searches and general site assessments to determine the potential issues, and then moving to more specific pre-construction surveys and finally to post-construction monitoring. Less common are projects that engage in research, but that is often driven by outside interests. When we think about these tiers of study and how they may be affected by change in technology, we see that the earlier tiers are less likely to need modifying. For example, Tier 1 and Tier 2 studies may be conducted for a large area where a project is proposed. But when we get to the Tier 3 and Tier 4 studies, the typical pre-construction and post-construction surveys, we may need to think about modifying methods or the study areas. A simple example that can be easily visualized is the size of the area where we would conduct monitoring surveys. Think of a turbine with only 20-meter blades versus one with 70-meter blades. Right away, we can see that the limit of the rotor diameter is more than 3 times further from the tower for the larger turbine. Depending on where in a rotor swept area a bird or bat collides with a blade,
Hey, Dave, did we lose you? Shayna, can you let me know if you can hear me?
Yeah, Joy, we can hear you. I think we just lost Dave.
We just lost Dave. Our last webinar, we seem to be having some problems. Oh, we changed slides. Hold on, I'm going to.
I can hear Joy now.
Yay, Dave, you're back. That was great. Take it away. We lost you about 4 minutes ago, 3 minutes ago.
So I was talking about, well, did I get to the example?
You didn't get, no, one slide back.
This one?
Yes.
Okay. So when we're talking about the size of the study areas where we might need to do our surveys, we think about the size of the turbines. Think of a turbine that only has 20-meter blades versus one with 70-meter blades. Right away, we can see that the limit of the rotor diameter is more than 3 times further from the tower for that larger turbine. Depending on where in the rotor swept area a bird or bat collides with the blade, along with some other factors like the wind speed and direction, casualties from a larger turbine would fall in much larger distribution around the tower. And for some of the routine analyses, the standard methods may need to be adjusted. For example, area correction factors would require consideration for a larger area where carcasses could be missed. And in the collision risk model for eagles, the height and width of a cylinder that would encompass a typical turbine may need to be adjusted to effectively develop the risk metric used in permitting. And on the research end of the study spectrum, determining the effective placement of deterrence, for example, may be a big challenge. I'm not a sound expert, but from what I understand, broadcasting sound that is in the range of bat echolocations over long distances is very challenging. So as the length of the blades increase, the deadly zone within the rotor, the area where the blade is moving fast enough to strike a bat, gets further and further from the nacelle. This may also hold true for other technologies that are becoming more common in data collection, such as thermal cameras or acoustic detectors for informing curtailment regimes. The view shed, in quotes here, needed to see the entire rotor swept area is increasing in size and may outreach the limits of the technology. For other resources of concern, such as grassland birds, the size of the turbine may influence spatial distribution of occupied areas if displacement from the turbines is occurring. We've learned a lot in recent years with studies designed to address spatial distribution of wildlife around turbines and projects. We've learned that depending on the species, displacement occurs in a gradient from the turbines. This is as distance from turbines increases, there's less change in wildlife abundance and occupancy. With changing technology, the question becomes, does that gradient extend even further from the turbine, or is there a limit at which turbine size has no influence? Also, with increased spacing among larger turbines, the total study area needs may increase and thus influence our study methods. In observational studies, it may be necessary to increase the area in which sampling points are distributed, or in radio telemetry studies, it may be necessary to increase the area in which subject birds are captured. But also in the context of this arms race of sorts, technology has been developed on the research and study side too that can be leveraged to help address changing technology on the turbine side. I mentioned previously the analytical method. There have been a number of advances in methods improving our ability to glean standardized or comparable results from individual studies or across a suite of studies. On the Eagle front, there have been advances in both the hardware measuring Eagle use and the analytical methods to predict risk. And in the offshore environment, combining technologies such as infrared cameras with vibration detection can help us quantify impacts in environments not conducive to our normal study methods. And newer technologies such as drones and machine learning are being employed to help collect, manage, and analyze these data-heavy sources. So in summary of considerations in research and study design with changing technology, we can see that depending on the study, some basic questions such as the size and location of the study area should be addressed up front to ensure we are adequately addressing the overall study objectives. So moving back to the former question of the grand challenge and thinking about what questions we need to answer and what data should be collected, it's important to set the stage with what we have learned that directs us to the new questions. There's a wealth of data collected over the past 25 years that is very useful in framing what we have learned and what questions should be asked. The purpose of the tiered approach to studies is primarily impact assessment that presumably drives conservation or permitting requirements to offset impacts. A great example of what we have learned that is directing us to ask new questions is with predicting impacts to bats. The primary tool for studying bat in pre-construction was acoustic detectors to measure the level of bat activity in an area and to a certain degree species composition and occupancy. A couple studies with limited data sets previously tried to find a correlation between this pre-construction activity and post-construction fatality, but a relationship between these data did not seem to exist. Recently, West published a study that addressed this question using data from 49 different studies from 46 wind projects, and again did not find a correlation. This weight of evidence suggests that a different study approach may be needed to predict impacts to bats pre-construction. The new questions being investigated now are looking at post-construction data from regional and nearby studies as a predictor of fatalities at new projects. Another really important question to address is the cumulative effect of bat fatality from wind. I'd like to illustrate this with some recent meta-analyses related to this topic that show some pretty interesting results. As turbine technology changes, is there a change in bat fatality, or more specifically, do larger turbines have greater impacts on bats? A recent analysis using data from 181 wind facilities ranging in size from 0.6 to 3.3 megawatt turbines found a correlation, albeit weak, between turbine size and bat fatality, and the total rotor swept area perhaps being more correlated with bat fatality. This makes sense when you think about the blade tip speed, which is likely the deadliest part of the blade. As blade length increases, the tip speed increases for any given RPM. For a blade 75 meters long, the tip speed is over 100 miles an hour at just 6 RPM, and closing in on 175 miles an hour at 10 RPM. So you can see it's pretty hard for a bat to avoid that collision. In another meta-analysis, data from 53 facilities with post-construction fatality estimates from multiple years were analyzed using some generalized linear mixed models to examine bat fatality rates as a function of the facility age and other environmental covariates. The analysis showed a decrease in bat fatality by approximately 25 to 30% with each year the facility was operational, and variable increases in bat fatality with environmental variables such as the temperature, cropland, forest patches, and amount of water. These types of analyses and results are important for directing that next level of study to determine causation or reasons for changes in bat fatality rate over time. It could easily be assumed that declining bat fatality rates are due to decreasing bat populations, but we continually see high bat fatality rates with newly constructed projects with newer technology. It is clear that additional study is needed to determine causation of these results, but the analyses are also useful for helping with other conservation-oriented decisions such as siting. The best model fit to the data showed increasing bat fatality rates with increasing temperature, increasing proportion of crops and forest land cover, and amount of open water and stream length. These data are useful in determining the landscape composition that would suggest greater or lesser bat fatality for any given project, and thus defining sites where lower impact would be expected. And these results we found in the study were similar to a number of other studies looking at fatality in relation to environmental variables. The ability of us to do these types of definitive analyses comes with a wealth of data that's been collected over the past 2 decades. Drawing back to the underlying big picture questions, we may be at a crossroads of sorts where we shift from the standard studies to leveraging the vast data to ask more specific questions that may be related to cumulative effects from the industry as a whole, as opposed to individual projects. To a certain degree, and for some topics, I think we have reached the point where additional data adds little value, the point of diminishing returns. However, we may not have data specific to all changes in the technology, thus suggesting a need for continued study of some newer technology. Before I close today, though, I'd like to touch a little bit more on the cumulative effects issue that Mike brought up. A little bit more on this, as this may be one of the most pressing questions from the conservation point of view, or how to frame this issue under this larger umbrella of climate change. Future evolving technology suggests more energy will be produced from renewable sources. This, coupled with some recent studies suggesting that impacts from wind turbines may be causing population level effects on some species, suggests that it is very important to get a handle on cumulative effects. Bats are not only affected by wind turbines, but many other stressors such as diseases, habitat loss, resource availability, and likely others. This is not to point the finger at other sources and downplay impacts from renewable energy, but this year illustrates at least 3 other sources of impact as potentially being important. Bats are subject to coronaviruses, believe it or not, just like humans. And the agencies throughout the US restricted survey protocols that require handling bats out of an abundance of caution that the biologists would not pass on COVID-19 to live bats. We also saw massive destruction of forests this year, likely due to climate change-induced wildfires. What happens to the bats that are utilizing those forests for foraging, roosting, and maternity areas? The fires also affect the distribution of suitable habitat and thus wildlife occupancy on the landscape. And headlines like this and others are becoming more common. Plummeting insects numbers threaten collapse of nature. A relatively recent publication in Biological Conservation put the decline in insect biomass at 2.5% per year. Basic ecological principles, such as the predator-prey cycle, would then suggest that species that rely on insects, the predators, would not have the same volume of resources on which to survive, much less thrive, as they previously had. The predator population would be expected to decline, not even remain stable. And this is not just with aerial insectivorous bats, but also that guild of birds. This alarm bell was sounded several years ago and certainly warrants further investigations, in my opinion. So how do you tease apart causation in the face of uncertainty, and perhaps more specifically, something like climate change? Is it incumbent on the renewable industry to determine all the cumulative effects? No, but it may be incumbent on the industry to address their impacts such that they are not additive to other cumulative effects. Future research priorities may then suggest there's a greater need for conservation than conducting the same studies and accumulating data defining impacts. Changes in technology may also direct solutions. For example, battery storage. That Mike mentioned this. Think of a simple contribution a battery can make in conservation. Stationary turbines do not kill bats or eagles. If stationary turbine could continue to provide energy to meet its obligations, then it could be managed so that it has little to no impact on these resources. The technology may not be here yet, and my biologist mind may be thinking a little too far outside the engineering box. But say each turbine or wind project could store enough energy that it could still meet project objectives with the turbines not turning, say, from sunset for 4 or 5 hours during the months of July, August, and September. If we could achieve that, then many, many bat lives would be saved. I know there are perhaps currently insurmountable hurdles to create this scenario at this time, but in looking for successful solutions that work for all parties, this evolving technology that we're talking about may play a big part in that. Repowering may be another conservation-oriented solution. If any given project can be repowered to produce more energy with less or the same footprint, and say, for example, wildlife living in and around projects habituate to their change in environment and behaviorally reduce their risk, then perhaps meeting growing energy demands and addressing climate change can be achieved with less new impact on the landscape through this repowering. I don't know if we know where the technology will cap out in terms of turbine size, but we can certainly hope for the sake of the climate and the planet that the ability to produce more energy per turbine continues to increase to meet those growing demands and replace carbon emitting sources and reach some of the goals that Mike was talking about. Being cognizant of the changing technology and understanding when we might not have the answer in hand already due to the technological changes may be the most important consideration for future study and research design. So I'll stop here and thank you again for letting me present today. I hope this conversation stimulates some continued thought and where to focus future resources in the study of wind and wildlife. I think I'll pass it back to Joy now for, I think we have time for some questions.
Great, thanks Dave, and I love your new profile picture. So we had a lot of interest in your study on size of the turbine. And so one of the questions was, is that based on megawatt or per turbine in that fatality study?
We looked at it in a lot of different ways. We looked at it per turbine and per megawatt, and like in other standardized methods like rotor swept area. And the rotor swept area, the volume of the rotor swept area was the one that seemed to be correlated the most with bat fatalities.
Great. And this is another bat question for Mike. One of the questions related to all of that wind build out and how the wind industry was still going to protect the hoary bat.
Yes, I think the quick answer on that is we are actively looking at hoary bats in terms of populations. I think, as you know, one of the main questions there is what are the actual populations, what are the population dynamics? But more than that, a lot of research in deterrence and in smart curtailment and other ways that would reduce impacts to all bats, including hoary bats. So it's been an important issue. I think Joy's been a leader on that actually in the bat coexistence work group that's kicked off a couple of years ago, and we and our members are active part of that. Looking for solutions, and I think the answer is we're investing quite a bit in trying to find ways to reduce those impacts, but it's not an easy problem to solve. So we'll continue to work on it.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I guess this question is for both of you, but I'll start with Dave. What plans are there to update post-construction monitoring for Cork carcasses with greater rotor swept area turbines?
So we've been doing that already, of course, and it really depends on the study and the study objectives and what we're looking for in a way. Some of the more recent updates, I mean, when you think about the size of the search area, it grows exponentially really quickly when you're trying to cover all of that area. So there's ways to sample that area to keep the searching kind of cost effective and correct the information through area correction factors. We've also been moving towards using dogs to do searches because they can cover a lot more area in a lot quicker time than humans can. And also then there's other newer methods that are being proposed. For example, if we're only looking for eagles, we've been very successful at using what we call a scan methods, where we stand at the turbine and look into the different quadrants, because eagles are fairly large birds, of course, and if the ground is fairly flat and doesn't have a lot of vegetation, it doesn't work, of course, in tall croplands. But and with low vegetation, you can spot eagle carcasses from quite a distance away. And so we've been working at modifying methods to cover those larger search areas, and also thinking about looking at on the animal side, on the carcass side, we have to think about the distribution and where they actually fall. And there's been a number of studies looking at things called ballistics models, looking at where bats and birds can actually land after being struck by a blade, and at the speed of the blade and how far the mass of the bird and stuff sort of in physics basically dictates how far away they can land to define how big your search area should be. I don't know if that answers the question, but there's been a lot of work in that regard.
Thanks, Mike. Did you have anything to add?
I think Dave covered it pretty well. I think that is the thing to emphasize, is that the methods that we use for estimating take is based on these bias correction factors that account for things like you don't search every single turbine, or you don't search all the way out to the point where any carcass could be found, and you make adjustments for that. It would simply be prohibitively costly to try to search every inch of every turbine area every day to get sort of that perfect information. But we've gotten very good at making those predictions and taking into account things that might have been lost or missed, sorry.
Awesome. And then one more quick question on bats. That seems to be the focus, which I love, as you guys know. Bat fatality studies are greatly appreciated. What is being done to investigate bat populations to help put bat mortality into a greater context? So I'll start with you again, Dave, and then go to Mike.
Sure. There's been a recent push to start to use or think about some of the other bat monitoring programs that are going on in the U.S. or North America, I think, such as the NA Bat program. North American Bat Program. They've had some standardized methods out there for surveying for bats, and some of those standardized methods allow for to essentially to count individual bats, which is a key metric, a key piece of data you need to come up with population abundances. We've been exploring some other more site-specific methods too, using acoustic detectors on mobile transects, where the detector is moving along a transect, or there's multiple detectors in the field, all recording simultaneously. So to try to get at numbers of bats. So just there's been sort of a push, and I know Joy knows this, to sort of work towards contributing to some of these other programs that will hopefully eventually start to give us more information on the abundances of bats on the landscape and trends in those. That's one thing. Then the other thing I'll mention real quick, and Mike may have some other stuff to add, is that there's also been a push to start to use genetics, genetic tissue sampling for using genetics to try to estimate population abundance or population sizes of bats.
And Mike, real quick, anything to add on that?
I don't think I need to add anything to that. I think you covered the efforts there, David.
All right, well, I want to thank both of you so much for your time and invite our panelists to share their cameras. We're gonna try it again. It seems that GoToWebinar is working better for us. But thank you again, Mike and Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have everyone, except Mike, you can turn off your camera. Thanks. So it's so exciting to have this group of diverse stakeholders. And I thought it would be best for you all to introduce yourselves, background in your role, and what is your role in the intersection of wind and wildlife? And I'm going to start in the order of how you guys appear on my screen. So I'm going to start with Sean.
Hi, yeah, my name is Sean Marson. I'm the Deputy Assistant Regional Director for Ecological Services for the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Midwest region, or the Great Lakes region. I supervise a number of our field offices in the Midwest region that are ecological services offices that work very closely with the wind industry and other stakeholders and partners on wind wildlife issues. We're currently involved with just a variety of efforts in relation to bats, HCPs, and wind in general.
Thanks, Sean. Adam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Renz, and I work for Pattern Energy, and I am a project developer at Pattern, and I have been fortunate enough to be transitioning from the world of politics and liberal arts to now being at a nexus when stakeholders range from the environmental to the political and to everything else in between. So that's my role within this broader group.
Thank you. Ellen.
Hi, everybody. Ellen Cravella from DNVGL. I lead our project development and engineering team. So we help onshore and offshore wind developers and also those with hybrid projects understand project development risks. So lots of discussions about wildlife and wind interactions. My team also looks out for things like understanding the resource assessment and potential curtailment associated with wildlife and mitigants for wildlife interactions. And then those of you who are familiar with DNVGL might know that we also hold the position in the industry where we tend to work for the banks and the financiers and those buying and selling projects as an independent engineer. So I suspect there'll be some questions and some discussion about that later on in the call as well.
Great, thank you. Brad.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Brad Loveless. I'm the Secretary for Wildlife Parks and Tourism in Kansas. I've been in this role about 2 years. Prior to this, I spent the first part of my career, 30 plus years, with an investor-owned utility in Kansas, Western Resources, Westar Energy, now Evergy. And in my role there, I was over the Environmental Services Department, and one of the key things that I did was to work on our team to decide what wind projects we wanted to take on. So I have some experience on that side of the equation as far as evaluating projects for their environmental acceptability and being part of the team that helped make those decisions. Today, with Wildlife Parks and Tourism, we have an ecological services group that works with wind developers and other kinds of developers to evaluate, give feedback, hopefully early on how their project is, what issues may arise from it, and how to negotiate, navigate those early on in the process. So that's my story.
Thank you, Brad. And Jocelyn.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much to both the NREL and Defenders team for the invitation to speak today, and also your work on this webinar series over the last several months. So I'm Jocelyn Renser-Sino. I am a program manager within the Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office, and I oversee our portfolio of work focused on environmental siting and workforce development activities. And the DOE Wind Program is a granting agency, and so what we do is we support research to further the development of wind energy in the United States. And we support research over a whole range of different topics, from how to improve wind turbine technology itself, how to ensure integration with the electrical grid, and then the portfolio I work on is really aimed at addressing environmental, particularly for the purposes of this conversation today, environmental impacts of wind energy, both supporting research to help us better understand those issues for both offshore and land-based wind, and then further develop and validate technical solutions to environmental impact.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So we've got a great lineup of perspectives. And so I have some questions that I'm going to ask the panelists, but I also encourage those listening to the webinar to also join in. I'm going to start at a broad perspective, and I'm going to start with Brad, since I believe states that will continue to be some of the most important drivers in our future work. And I think engaging states and getting your perspectives is going to be more important than ever. And I'm not sure we've always done a great job in the past. So Brad, as you look to the future, what are the largest priorities for states given the limited resources? And how can various stakeholder groups like developers, federal agencies, researchers, NGOs, et cetera, how can we all do a better job working with state agencies for the future?
So it's a central question for us, so thank you for it. The key issue with us, I think, is having conversations early and sharing as much information as developers are able to. I know there's a tension between sharing information and concerns about competitiveness, and we certainly understand that. But we find that we can have much more constructive conversations if they start early in the process When a developer gets with us later on, when they've already made commitments, then it becomes costly and their flexibility is limited. So we love those early conversations. This morning, I was reviewing a 8 or 9 page letter to an outfit about trying to build a transmission line in Kansas. And it was a long letter because it was a long transmission line. And the thing I liked about it, I complimented our staff because they were very thorough in talking about all the potential challenges as they crossed a good portion of our state. And it was just laying things out there. And so to me, from a business perspective, because that's where I came from, that's the kind of information we need to make good informed decisions and avoid problems and controversy later on. So early conversations, I think, are critical. The second thing I'd say is challenging developers to have high standards. Michael did a great job presenting earlier. He talked about using high standards, using the wind energy guidelines, and we find that some developers are good at that, some are not so good. And so when they maintain high standards, it makes it easy because it shortens conversations. They know to avoid those critical areas, and we appreciate that. It becomes less of a battle. And we think that, well, my experience, I'll just tell you, in the wind, when I worked for the utility, we had problems with bird collisions and electrocutions in our case. And so we developed a group called the Avian Powerline Interaction Committee to try to raise the bar higher for our industry, because we found some utilities were spending a lot of money and being really careful, and others were ignoring it. And so what we tried to do was raise the bar for the whole industry and use the standard. And it turned out Fish and Wildlife Service would point to the standards that we developed. If you do that, then you're meeting our standards too. So that's a great thing. I know that's hard to do because the wind industry is so competitive, but those high standards are important. The last thing I might mention is, in my experience, we don't view either you have renewables or you have this accelerated climate change. We really endorse green renewables, ones that are not only renewable, but they're renewable in the right spot. Back to siting, as has been discussed. That's what's critical for us, because certainly in Kansas, we're faced with some species that are, we're being told by researchers, there's no more room to infringe on their habitat. At this point, they can't really recover if we keep putting stuff, whether it's roads or wind turbines or transmission lines or oil pumps in that area. We ain't got no more habitat. So that becomes critical for us. So those are the challenges that we face and the things that we encourage developers to do.
Thank you, Brad. I love what you said about raising the bar. I'm going to shift now to Sean, who also has his work cut out with him, given the mounting threats to species. So Sean, what are the service's biggest priorities for the future when it comes to regulating wind energy and wildlife impacts? And what species do you anticipate will be your biggest focus going forward?
I missed the last part of that question, Joy. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'll move past. What species in specific do you think will be the biggest priority for the service for the future?
For the future. So I'd say that, and this was mentioned in earlier presentations, the tree bats are certainly ones that we are very interested in. We're starting to gather information on those fronts. We are in the midst, and I'm speaking primarily from a Midwest region standpoint, but also these species have ranges that extend well beyond the Midwest region, but we are in the midst of evaluating 3 species for listing. So the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolored bat. I should say the little brown bat is a discretionary review, and so that's when the agency takes the initiative to do that. We've been petitioned to evaluate the tricolored bat from an outside entity, and then the northern long-eared bat is one where it is listed as a threatened species, but that's gone through litigation, and that decision has been remanded back to us. So now we're reevaluating that species to see if it warrants listing as endangered now. So we're in the midst of those status assessments. We are hoping to complete those assessments by the spring or summer of 2021. That assessment is a collaborative effort. We're involving U.S. Geological Survey, state agencies, Bat Conservation International has been very helpful in that regard as well in terms of the data analysis and assessment. And so again, that would be in the summer of 2021 where we hope to complete those assessments. And then those assessments will inform the listing evaluation process, which is where we apply the Endangered Species Act policy to listing policy to that assessment and see whether or not those species warrant listing. And so the hope is that we would publish those findings by the summer of 2022 for all three of those species. Now, the northern longrear-bat, because it's involved in litigation, that might be on a different timeline, but that's our hope. So those are at least a few of the species that we're currently working on. And as I mentioned, we don't have a status assessment right now for the hoary bat, but that's certainly a species that's on our radar, and folks are working to try to gather data to better understand impacts to that species.
Thank you, Sean. That's a lot. And so Jocelyn, on that note, since these resource agencies do have a lot on their plate, how do you see Department of Energy's role in resolving wind energy and wildlife issues? And how does the Department of Energy develop their priorities?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Department of Energy's wind program is a granting agency whose mission is really centered around supporting science, R&D to really help resolve challenges with respect to wind energy development in the country. And so our work in the wind wildlife space, we've been working in this area for close to 3 decades now, and it's really rooted in that basis. We look to really help support the science to help us understand and characterize what impacts are. And then, as I mentioned earlier, work to develop both the tools that really help us resolve issues around how we monitor. And this is particularly true in the offshore space, where there are some challenges with respect to questions that are harder to ask and answer. And then also technology solutions to minimize impact. And we developed a research strategy and a set of kind of explicit research priorities in about the 2016 timeframe that built upon decades of work by the wind wildlife community, a lot of work, especially through research cooperatives and collaborative efforts to identify what are the questions that we need to ask and answer, and of those, what are highest priority. And we looked across that and really tried to parse what are the questions that DOE is best suited to help support here. So we see some of the, for instance, population questions as being a little bit further outside of our wheelhouse, whereas some of the specific impact questions and the technology questions being better aligned with DOE's mission space. And we put together a draft strategy and held a public meeting around that strategy, got some great insight from a group of stakeholders with respect to that. And that formed the basis for our kind of a living set of research priorities for us moving forward. And in the land-based space, those research priorities are really focused at this point around bats, probably as our highest priority, eagles, and then grouse species.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And I know so many of us are so thankful to the role Department of Energy has played in this space. Now I'm going to turn it over to the industry. So Adam, when the industry looks to the future, what are the largest challenges you are facing, and how do wildlife interactions intersect with those challenges?
First and foremost, I feel like I'm now the corporate shill that I'm gonna get just punched at. So be gentle to me, everybody.
You get Ellen too. She's a little corporate. We'll go to the next.
Right. That's who I punch
I
up
got
with.
your back,
I punch
Adam.
up with Ellen. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
Thank you guys all for letting me join this. This is fantastic, and I feel honored. Brad, I think everything you were saying, I was on mute, but I was just groaning affirmatives too. I think the hardest piece right now in the development space is citing. Figuring out where to place a project that both makes economic sense and is viable from all of the other, again, corporate chili standpoints, in addition to overlaying with siting constraints, whether they're military airspace, whether it's an environmental issue, whether it's seasonal or year-round. There's not a lot of space left where we formerly were seeing easy generation projects being built, and transmission was less of an item that us in the development community needed to think about or worry about. Now that the smaller projects, the easier putts, the whatever you want to refer to them are gone, the low-hanging fruit, you're seeing developers have to get extremely creative, and in some cases play the role that was initially played by utilities, and building our own kind of farm to market roads or path to market roads via transmission lines to get our power from lower impact spots into higher load territories. And I think that we need, as an industry, and again, Brad, I think you hit this and Mike hit it on his intro, we need to think about, and I think at Pattern we're doing a plug for ourselves, I think we're doing a really great job because we've got a phenomenal environmental and permitting team thinking about environmental impacts from day one. And if not day one, I want to call that, as my colleague Adam Clark will say, at day zero, or even the earliest phases of development. We need to be thinking about all of the impacts, not just how much does this land cost, but does it have a visual impact on it? Is it going to be impacting a species? So on and so forth. So that's my piece, is citing.
Great, thank you, Adam. And now we're going to turn over to your partner in crime, Ellen. Where does the consulting community see the greatest growing demand for meeting your clients' wind and wildlife challenges?
Did you say the last part again, Jocelyn? Or Joy, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry. I'm going to get closer to my mic. Where do you guys see the greatest demand for meeting your clients' wind and wildlife challenges?
Yes, good question. You know, I think an important thing to talk about is that our clients are changing, and that the way projects are developed is changing. There are a lot of utilities out there that have big targets for renewable energy, which I think is fantastic. But utilities, not all of them have traditionally served as developers. And so that means you have groups like Adam's team who are doing a great job of trying to find those sites, like Brad said, that are, you know, least impactful, citing them in the right place the first go around. But then, you know, at some point you might have a utility that approaches Adam and team and says, hey, you know, you're in our service territory. Instead of us just signing up a power purchase agreement with you all, we actually maybe would want you to do something like a build transfer arrangement for us. And we'd actually like to own and operate that facility. And so that adds an entirely different wrinkle, because now you have, in some instances, an entity that is developing the project that may or may not be regularly communicating with the end operator of the project. And so having things like the land-based guidelines, having a strong BBCS or other document that carries through some of those development plans, mitigation commitments, et cetera, that makes it really clear for the operator is actually becoming much, much more of an important thing. And in fact, that's an area where we're starting to help a lot of our customers, is even if they are going to develop and then build and own and operate it themselves, they want to have really good manuals for operations. And they really want to have a strong strategy and a game plan for what do we do if there are unanticipated impacts. Who do we call? What is curtailment an option for us, or is it shutdown? Is it technology add-on? What exactly could the potential options be? So I think we're getting much more to a place where impacts are trying to be anticipated and planned for right up front, knowing that the ultimate owner of the project might not actually be the ones who engaged early on with Brad and Sean in those pre-development type conversations.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm going to build on that response, and we're going to shift to a new focus on the technology that we've talked about. And I want to remind folks in the audience out there to please submit your questions as well. But Ellen, as we've talked a lot in this webinar series, technology and operational minimization is really gaining increasing attention, and it's going to be an important element in advancing wind energy responsibly. So when you look at your clients, what do you see as the biggest barriers to advancing those solutions? And where should stakeholders that really want these technologies to be adopted prioritize our time to overcome those barriers?
Oh, such a good and complicated question. And so I'm going to take a stab at it, but I'm sure actually everyone on this panel has thoughts on this. I often come from the perspective of how do you develop a project so that it is easily financed, or so that there is an easy financial transaction at the end of it. So maybe you're selling your project too. And when it comes to technology solutions, they are often cool and interesting and can have really good outcomes. But at the end of the day, a lender or a potential buyer of your project wants to understand, is that technology proven? Is it going to work? Is it going to do the thing that it said it was going to do? And that's everything from, is it going to maintain some level of productive mechanical nature? Is the battery going to last as long as you thought it was going to? Is it actually going to deter the species or mitigate for the impact that you intended? And so what that often then comes down to is, well, what do the key stakeholders think about this? What does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service say about this? What does your permit granting authority think about this? Are they okay with it? And have the right questions been explored in terms of what happens if they're not okay with it, or if it doesn't perform in the way that you anticipated? So, technology, I think, holds a lot of promise, but we, in some ways, need to get over that hump of helping people feel comfortable that the technology is acceptable and proven. And it's not as though memos or documentation is super easy to come by. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, doesn't certify a piece of technology, and I'm not suggesting that they should. But, something like that would make a lender go, okay, well, we can feel pretty comfortable that everyone's going to be cool with this. So, it is a, for good reason, that does not happen. That provides, there's more flexibility in the solutions that can be implemented then, if there is not a specific approach that has been blessed by a state resource agency or the Fish and Wildlife Service. But the flip side to that too is there's still some uncertainty. And so then we have to look to other matters, other data to see if there's some sort of analogy that can be drawn upon. Have you implemented these technology solutions in your fleet before? Has another project nearby implemented these technology solutions with good results? And so we look to see for those sorts of pieces of information to help us get all stakeholders comfortable when we need to. But I'd love to hear other perspectives on this too.
Thanks, Ellen. And I'm going to do just that. I'm going to shift to Jocelyn, because the Department of Energy obviously has been focused on this and has been a huge driver of new technology development. So Jocelyn, can you speak to projects that have shown success or advanced towards commercialization?
Sure, yeah. And I maybe before I dive into kind of the question of success, I'll talk a little bit about the approach that we use to supporting technology. development. So when we support research at R&D around technologies, we do so kind of with the construct of technology readiness levels. So how do we think about systematic technology development in a way that you go all the way from very early TRL or technology readiness level, where you've got kind of a concept for a potential technical solution, all the way up to where a technology is commercially ready, it's been validated, probably in this context at multiple sites across multiple geographies, et cetera, and folks have confidence in the way that Ellen was describing, and we're moving towards confidence that they'll be effective if deployed in a novel location. And we try to support work. A lot of our work is actually supporting in some of the earlier to mid TRL levels, with the idea of not just having kind of validated solutions for today, but making sure that we've got a full toolbox of potential solutions, because we're probably going to need more than one tool for any particular issue. And we have those solutions ready not only for today, but that we're working to anticipate challenges of the future. Like Dave was talking about, our turbines are getting larger. What does that mean for the specifications that we need to think about for our technical solutions? And also thinking about, when we think about it from an early TRL perspective, also thinking about how do we build affordability in from the outset, and go through a series of stepwise processes for really helping validate and develop technology, and then have design feedback loops where we learn from each validation step. So we've been investing in a lot of work around stepwise testing, where validation doesn't just happen at a commercial wind farm where you're asking a commercial business to host an experimental technology. You might be asking them to fix it to their turbines, or integrate with their SCADA system, or alter their operation of their wind farm. All of that is, it's high risk asks, but instead are doing some of that earlier stage validation in more controlled settings, like our National Wind Technology Center, where we've got experimental turbines using things like false targets like drones to really be able to systematically test and validate tracking detection capabilities, shooting tennis balls at turbines to try to look at whether we can automatically detect collisions, those sorts of things. But I think we've had this emphasis on technology as kind of a major part of our portfolio for the last 5 years. And so a lot of the technologies that we're supporting are still in that technology development pipeline. That said, there are a number of technologies that we're currently supporting that have had really promising kind of higher technology readiness level results in the field. So the energy back deterrent device DOE has provided support for through a number of different competitive funding efforts, all the way from when it was the early DN device up to today, where we're supporting work to help advance test and flight cages, behavioral responses, and use that to help optimize the deterrent stimulus. We have supported the testing of the GE bat deterrent device, and are supporting further efforts to validate that system in the future. And then we're also working to help validate the Identiflight unit, which has shown really promising results, as well as the DT Bird combined camera and Eagle deterrent system, which has shown some promising results as well.
Thanks, Jocelyn. There's so many exciting research opportunities going on. And I'm going to switch now to Adam, and I'm going to integrate a question from the audience in here. And so Adam, on the same line of technology and minimization, how do you see these types of technologies, how do you see the wind industry integrating these types of technologies in your future work? And also, what do you expect the turbines of the future to look like, for example, in 2040 or 2050? And will these emerging technologies be compatible with those new turbines?
Okay, so the first part, let me start off where I kind of want to pick up a little bit from where Ellen and Jocelyn were both hinting. Pardon me, let me get that sunset out of my face. I believe that one of the biggest stress points right now is that you've got development entities, private sector like myself at Pattern. Our teams are looking at creative ways that we can mitigate and bake technology, even if it's in its very nascent stage, into these projects, because if we can do anything to positively impact or mitigate troubles that our projects could be imparting, that's a value add. However, going back to Ellen's point that financing at the end of the day, whether it's Pattern financing a project that we're going to hold and operate, or especially if it's a project like Western Spirit Transmission that Pattern is, working on, but will be transferring over to PNM of New Mexico's utility universe this time next year, we have a different onus and a whole bunch of different issues on how we bake in this technology. Because if we want to make a base case for something that uses infrared lights, or ultraviolet lights to show river crossings that would drop already low potential crane impacts, we have to account for why this is tried and true and tested, or if it's not tried and true and tested, what the data is that backs it up. And maybe the data is there in private tests and studies, but this goes back to the point where I'm sure Brad and everyone can appreciate this. If an agency has not bought in, that makes our life extremely difficult. So I think finding ways, and I know that this is something that's close to Jocelyn and the NREL team's heart, finding ways that we can get government agencies and national laboratories to support and help us when we're making the case on these investments, that is what I believe is what's going to be a game changer for us already, getting to act upon our creativity. So it's early investment that needs to come from us. But I think the other half of that social contract is that, developers, researchers, and agencies need to be on the same track. And I think that's challenging regardless of your political regime who's in power. But it's frustrating. So that's for a bigger question, or for a broader group. And then to the tech turbines of the future, if we're talking about wind in particular, I guess I'm being a little bit boring here. I do think that the turbines of today are going to be very similar to what we're going to see 40 years from now. I think the biggest component will be size and scale. And I am confident that the technologies of mitigation, using Identiflight's a great example, will be much more tested, tried out, and improved in the next 4 decades, that you'll see more success off of those technologies. But at the end of the day, the sky is truly the limit when it comes to how big our turbines can get. And I think that's where offshore is going to come into a huge play. But the better that we can erect and safely monitor and mitigate wind generation in more remote places and then get that power to market, in theory, I think that's what's going to really drive the industry forward in the coming decades. And I do think that ideas like Identiflight and similar technologies are huge. And I also want to plug, again, going back to agencies, the FAA and the DoD are 2 other huge players that, maybe we've got the ability or the desire to put lighting mitigation on turbine towers to dim FAA lights, but it's not always just the FAA. We're just now getting them comfortable in the last few years on this, but you still have DoD presence. So as we start getting into more and more remote places for population load, you may have military installations across Texas and, New Mexico and the West, where there's not a lot of population, but there is another user, the DoD, who is very opinionated about health and safety when it comes to what this could mean by dimming these lights and impacting the men and women who are flying those aircraft and doing those tests. So I just want to broaden this out there for this group, that it's not just the agencies that we typically think about that we need to worry about and partner with. It's a lot of the DoD and military entities as well.
Well, and Adam, if I could just jump in too, there's also the public to be concerned about and, make sure that they're on board with the project. I think somebody posted in the chat window a question about painting turbines black and if that helps to deter impacts, and that it might, but you then might get the local county commissioners who say, no way, no how do we want big spinning black blades in our community.
Right.
Same thing goes with acoustic deterrence. Those aren't particularly things that landowners really love. You know, you don't want to hear a big boom or some loud sound go off every couple of minutes or seconds. So, you know, it's balancing the technology with like what will make sense from a community and other agency acceptance perspective.
And the issue, just to further enhance that, you've got landowners who are participating, they're receiving some form of financial benefit to being involved with the project, and then you've got non-participating neighbors, which that adds fuel to the fire. And at the end of the day, in our opinion as developers, they are all stakeholders. And in 2020 and beyond, any stakeholder has the ability to grind a project to an absolute halt, especially if you've got someone who's, you know, a retired lawyer or has great connections in a state capital or in a local county, you know, county government spectrum, or just has a lot of money and a lot of free time. So we need to make sure that we're collectively involving, you know, the entire spectrum of stakeholders, from the traditional, the permitting folks that we're used to, but other folks who are just supporting, you know, the monarch butterfly, or, you know, the sandhill crane. Like, there are some very unique smaller groups, and when you get these bigger projects that start crossing, you know, many county lines, or in the topic of linear infrastructure like transmission, you may be crossing an entire state or entire region. You may have saguaro cactuses and sandhill cranes and the military, and then you may be dumping into California, and you've got a huge spectrum of issues. How do you work on that? What do you do if you've got 9 out of your 10 permitting bodies signed off, but one's not? I mean, it's a very difficult challenge, and I do think that is where the groups that are convened today are going to be working collectively in the decades to come to fix this, to work on this.
Wow, it is certainly complicated. And to complicate things further, I'm going to pass it off to Sean quickly. And how is the service thinking about technology and permitting going forward, if you have any comments?
There we go. Yeah, I was going to add that I think the way that we've addressed it to date is just a recognition that there's a lot of new technology that, while it's not yet proven, we're willing to work with companies to include that technology in their planning and permitting with buffers for the uncertainty that's inherent in these sorts of new technologies. So when it comes to saying, for deterrence, for example, what's the % reduction you're going to get in terms of bat fatalities? If we don't know that with precision, we know that it works to some degree, then we can build in the permitting structure and the planning structure just a buffer that allows for that uncertainty, and then we can refine that through adaptive management over time.
Yes, thanks, Sean. And I've seen the service start to do this, and I think it's a great way to get folks upticking that technology and getting it tested. I am going to shift away for technology, but Brad, feel free to share your comments as well, since we've gone around to something equally as complicated. So Brad, with increasing changes in the climate, are you finding in your state that there is a change in the bird and bat migration? And how are you accounting for that possible change in your wildlife standards or your work?
Yeah, thank you. I've got a short answer to this. I talked with my ecological services staff and asked if this was kind of central to their consideration, and if they were really having to shift perspectives. And they said up to this point they haven't. Clearly there are things going on, but they pale by comparison with the other broader issues that aren't as subtle maybe as some of these climate shifts, but species impacts are more dominated by other issues as opposed to climate. So for us, that's not a big consideration right now here in the middle of the Great Plains.
Well, I guess that's one thing that you don't have to complicate your work with, at least for now.
Amen.
And so our last 15 minutes, I think we're gonna kind of reflect on some lessons learned and look forward. So I'm gonna go back to Sean. Sean, your region in particular is credited for some really innovative efforts to advance responsible wind energy development and conservation. And one great example is the low effect HCP on bats. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit about what prompted these efforts and if you have any plans for the future, similar opportunities to advance conservation and regulatory certainty.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. That's a good question. In terms of what it prompted our efforts, and I can explain what that low effect or low impact short-term HCP is, but what prompted it was just the workload that is associated with wind development in the Midwest region. So we've got a relatively small offices and limited folks available to support permitting and planning for wind projects. And over these past 10 years or so, we've just seen a significant increase in the amount of activity. And listening to Mike's presentation earlier, looking at the future, it's clear that there's just going to be a continued growth and workload in this realm. So that was the genesis, or the reason why we went with this short-term template approach. And what it is essentially, it's an attempt on our part, on industry's part, to reduce the timeline associated with developing an HCP and getting a permit from years down to hopefully a handful of months. And what it looks like, it's rather than a life of project permit, it's a short-term template permit where it would only be for a 6-year period, and there would be intensive monitoring during that 6-year period, and we'd learn about the project and learn about what the risks are, and be able to essentially do hopefully a more streamlined NEPA process associated with that short-term permit. And then at the end of that 6-year period, we would see if there aren't any risks, or if there are risks, then we'd go for a longer-term permit. But it's essentially a way to get the project permitted much more quickly, and then have an evaluation period so that we can decide what the most appropriate path is for that remaining 24 years or whatever the remaining life of the project would be. And the hope would be to build on this 6-year template idea. So the template's about 30 to 40 pages. It's relatively simple to complete. The hope is that we could do a CADX associated with that, but we'd have to evaluate each project and do the NEPA on each project to make that determination. But the hope is that we could build a similar process for the remaining project life, a similar simplistic template that we could, at the end of that 6-year period, or during that 6-year period, complete that part of the process to permit the project for its life.
Thanks. I've heard a lot of great things about it, so excited about the efficiencies. And interesting too that it was spurred by your resource load as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so our hope is to have the first short-term permit out very, very soon. I don't want to put a time on it, because then I'll probably be proven wrong, but hopefully within a very short amount of time.
Great, that's exciting. So moving away from permitting for a moment, I'm gonna head to Brad. Another growing challenge is local community opposition. I keep hearing about how it's growing to wind energy, and I've heard you share your insights on this before. So would you mind sharing with the audience why you think we're seeing growing local opposition? And how can developers and other stakeholders do a better job of engaging with local communities?
Sure. Yeah, this is really important. I've been dealing with it a lot in Kansas. Two things I would coach developers on are, first, transparency, and second, consider broadening your scope when it comes to dealing with your stakeholders. The transparency part, as I alluded to earlier, is difficult because there is a stiff competition for these projects, and I understand that. But what I've found very recently is when developers are doing kind of the minimum in terms of transparency, it creates a sense by other folks in the community, people who are opposed or people who simply don't know, or neighbors who don't have a turbine on their property, whatever, that, gee whiz, this is a freight train that is passing me and I can't do anything to affect it. This gets to Ellen's point about community acceptance. you know, when the folks that have turbines on their property, and you all have mentioned a lot of these are occurring in rural areas, those folks are happy. You create this huge schism in these communities where there's the folks that are for and the folks that are against. And I can drive you to one about an hour from here where everybody's got signs out, right? And I would submit that that's not good for community certainly, but it's not good for the industry in general, because it ends up being an NPR or a 60 Minutes piece on you know, neighbors fighting neighbors, and it's just not good. So what I would say is the important thing that I think developers can do is help those county, most of the time it's county commissioners, and in these rural areas, these are people that have other professions and may be really sophisticated. You know, instead of Kansas City, it's Mankato or it's Pretty Prairie where this is happening. And so as developers, you can help coach them through this and use the best techniques to be more transparent than they're used to being, and sharing information with citizens and making it a more open process. I think that would be great. The second thing I'd point out is, in terms of being a better partner, is in terms of your dealings with your off-takers, with people buying the power, the utilities. I have an example here in Kansas. We've got the Flint Hills, 3% left of the Tallgrass Prairie, and there was a project put in the Southern Flint Hills several years ago, and it was bought by a utility, a big utility with a big environmental staff that just didn't have an environmental voice on their search committee. So it was a terrible spot to put a wind project, but this very responsible utility did it. And what I would like to see is, as opposed to just making a sale, I would love to see developers who go to a utility or a buyer and say, here, we have this spectrum that we can offer you. You're right. If we put it over here, it's going to cost more money. You all, several have mentioned about the cost of this, and we don't talk about that enough, right? The reason why we're putting projects where we are right now is it's the cheapest places, right? So let's be open about the trade-offs with environmental cost versus you know, power cost, right? Years ago in the utility industry, we put coal plants up, we put whatever we wanted into the air and whatever into the water, and there was no accounting for it, right? Coal was real cheap. Well, now you got to account for all that. It's more expensive. I think wind and other renewables will be the same way. We need to have full cost accounting for that. That should keep us out of these environmentally challenged areas, into the areas where it'll cost a little bit more, but in terms of environmental acceptance and this long-term perspective, I think we'll be healthier for it. So I would encourage those kind of full cost accounting to be considered.
If I could just jump in, I love this idea. Yeah, it's really interesting, but we're beholden to FERPA, right? So the utilities have to pick the lowest cost projects typically for their ratepayers. Otherwise, the PUC has to approve some type of exception. So like, Brad, I'm totally on board and like drink the Kool-Aid just right here and now with you. And you know, I love it. But it's such a convoluted issue where there are multiple levels of regulatory hindrances that, you know, it's like, how would we even take that on as an industry?
Right. So my response is that's the seat I was sitting in before. We routinely rejected the lowest cost projects because they were cutting corners environmentally. And we sold that. The way it worked for my investor-owned utility was we had to sell that to the board as a corporate business decision. The regulators, you know, overall, right, we have to keep costs low, but that was being transparent. We told them we could have picked a lower cost project. Here's the problems, right? The community didn't accept it, or environmentally, it was a big cost. And they agreed with that, but it's a matter of being open about all those costs. And I think we can do better at that and having a broader conversation.
And just to flag, I forget the statistics. I wish, I don't know if Mike is still here and if he has it in the back of his pocket. I remember hearing it for years from AWIA folks, but there is an actual tangible benefit to properly cited and thoughtfully developed projects over their lifetime. They are traditionally cheaper to maintain. If you don't have to worry about massive compliance issues or post-construction monitoring because of something you did that was highly preventable, or ongoing issues with neighbors, your project is going to be a much better investment, both for you as an operator or for whoever will eventually be operating that or living around it. And I do think that you have to have your management teams aware of this, and early on in the development process, budget for this. Almost you need to slap your finance team's hand and say, yes, we could do this a little bit cheaper, but at what cost? Because there will be a cost for everything over the big picture.
Right, I agree. And as an industry, you look at Mike's numbers going out to 2050, what Joe Biden's saying, we're going to be in this for a long time. So we have to take a long-term perspective, and we have to start, working harder. A lot of people do a really good job of this. A lot of developers do, but take that longer-term perspective and build trust with all the communities we're working in. Everybody won't always agree, but we can disagree based on facts and in an open fashion and move the ball forward and get healthier over time. So I look forward to that.
Well, and it underscores the need for a broader policy when it comes to renewable development for the longer term, because then Adam, when Pattern's competing against all of the other developers out there, when there is an RFP for power procurement, I mean, typically the thing that gets you the win is the least cost of energy. And so the incentive is there to potentially cut out costs where you can. And sometimes that happens to be in the environmental realm.
Right.
Also, just...
Oh, you're on mute, Adam.
Oh, am I on mute still? Sorry, better? Okay. One of the other pet peeves, this is just a personal gripe, so I'm just going to air it in the end of 2020 with all of you, but people know that renewables, wind in particular, are extremely cost competitive. In some markets, we're tying or beating new build nat gas, right? But oftentimes I'll hear from stakeholders in the field of, well, my power prices are going up. I'm not seeing any benefit of this. And I think that's a very real frustration. I get it at every holiday gathering back in the olden times when we had holiday gatherings with people. And it's hard to say, yeah, I actually know what I'm saving NRG or whoever your off taker is on this new contract. But I can't say you're going to get passed on to you. So one of my dreams and wishes in the future is better visibility and transparency into where those savings go from utilities or an off taker. If AWS is giving a better deal to Netflix for their green electrons because they're doing it completely with new build, new generation, it would be wonderful to see some level of sign off on this is a low cost energy that had no electrons added into it. So anyway, that's just a rant for over a beer.
Thanks, and agree, Adam. And now we have a special guest that would like to make a comment. Mike.
Am I a special guest if I was already on this in this section?
Yes, a special guest to the panel. You're always special.
I just wanted to jump in to chime in on this discussion about the cost there, and I don't have that number, Adam. I don't. Maybe it was before my time that was produced, but I do want to note, because it does relate to some of the things that I was talking about the sort of broad picture, that the challenge is where we mostly live. So I think if you're talking about, say, the Flint Hills, or if you're talking about being, half a mile from a Indiana bat hibernacula or something like that, you can kind of see, there should be incentive, and there should be, responsible development that keeps you away from those kinds of areas. Unfortunately, most of where we live are areas that are much more gray than that. I mean, gray area, not like the color gray, but there's different things that we're still trying to better understand and whatnot. So, I think, trying to send, I think, Brad, you're getting towards sort of cost signals about things, where to go, becomes difficult when you're not sure what the impacts are. That the points that I made about the impact assessment of indirect impacts, for example, it's really tough. And then again, one of my points was, well, then what about the benefits there? Because it's not like it's all, even if you're in these areas of uncertain impacts, there's benefits coming from that, whether it's climate, whether it's preservation, whether it's other things like that. So it's not to muddy it or to disturb the Kool-Aid, but I think that there's some potential there to talk about things. I think it's exciting, but it's unfortunately not as easy as that, and there's a lot of things going on that we have to consider as developers.
Thanks, Mike. And we just have a few more minutes, or one more minute. I was going to end with Jocelyn. As you're listening to this discussion, where do you fit in from Department of Energy's perspective on addressing some of these challenges?
Sorry, I was on mute. Got to end a 2020 webinar with somebody being on mute. So, I mean, these are multifaceted questions, right? And they involve everything ranging from policy to market to cost of technology siting decisions, and then kind of business decisions themselves. And so DOE as a granting organization, I guess, I don't know that we have a position here, but I think what we can do is we can help support R&D where there are science questions at their core here that can help it unlock some of these questions.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists again. You guys have rounded out a 9-part webinar series that was a labor of love, and I couldn't imagine a better way. So thank you so much for the conversation. And those in the audience, we will be releasing a question and answer document that will answer some of the questions that were asked that we didn't get a chance to, as well as share some of the studies that were mentioned. So thank you again, guys, and enjoy hopefully your last webinar of 2020.
Thank you.